Now we're good.
Now we're recording. Okay, so we have a lot of information tonight. And so before I dive into that, I wanted to just give y'all space. Do you have any questions from anything in our past weeks or anything that you were hoping to ask in tonight's call before we dive into a lot of information and a case study at the end that kind of ties it all together? We're doing brain and reproductive system. Allie and I put way too much on our plate this week. This was a very complex system. So just a heads up, it's a lot. Like I think when we re-upload this for y'all, we might even condense the PowerPoint because it's just a lot. So
yeah,
anyways,
a lot.
Sure. Do y'all have any questions, or if you think of one, just write it in the chat. We'll kind of make sure we cover that. Amanda, did you have a question?
Yeah, quick question. I was just going through like trying to save things offline before they all go away. Yeah. And I know some of them did that funny thing where it like lets you view them, but I've Googled like coding and I can figure out how to get them to download if they weren't uploaded like that. I've gone through like and have a list of them. It's like a handful of modules that the presentations aren't downloadable.
Are you doing it on your computer?
Yeah, I'm doing it on my computer.
Okay.
I've tried it on my phone too, though. It still didn't work. It still does the funny like view thing.
That's interesting. Okay.
But yeah, I just didn't know if anybody had figured out a way to do that, or if I could just like send you guys a list of like the handful that I think it was like 4 or 5 of them or something that wouldn't.
Yeah, if you wanna send me a message just privately and say these are the ones that aren't working, maybe I'll notice a pattern or something that I just need to change. If not, what we'll end up doing is maybe I can just add them to like the resources PDF list. I mean, there's a ton in there, but whatever, we'll figure out a way to get them to you guys if they're still not working, but hopefully it's just a setting.
Okay, sounds good. Yeah, I'll send you a message. Thank you.
Awesome. Okay, so we are going to do brain reproductive system. I'll share my screen. I'll leave the chat open just in case, and Allie's always great too about helping me with that as we go through. Okay, so before I dive into all of this, just wanted to reiterate, like, this is a ton of information and it can be so overwhelming. I don't get overwhelmed often, and I was learning all this and it made me overwhelmed. And I had to go back and remind myself that truly to support these systems, it comes back to basics and foundations and controlling the controllable factors. So I also know with these two systems, a lot of times in situations, things are beyond our control, and that's where we pray about it. We lay it at his feet, and we don't get overwhelmed by situations and things and diagnoses of what we were born with or circumstances. So anyways, just wanted to lay the forefront on that. And I'm not going to like read these slide per slide. I just wanted y'all to have the information and kind of understand the way that the brain is. So it's highlighted. We're going to go over each part of the brain and its ultimate function, and then we'll kind of dive into left and right hemisphere. So the brain is the most complex part of the human body. It weighs 3 pounds. It's the seat of intelligence, interpreter of senses, body movements, behaviors, mood. And lying in its bony shell, it's washed by a protective fluid. It's a source of basically all the qualities that define humanity, and it's considered the crown jewel. So that is sort of like the basics of the brain, and then it's broken up into segments that we'll get to here in a little bit. This is sort of a picture that highlights, and the thyroid's included in this, but the different hormones that are produced from the different parts of the brain. So you have the pineal gland, which can get disrupted due to heavy metals, blue light. Glyphosate is a really big one, nutrient deficiencies, stress, which will interfere with the production of melatonin. So that is the responsibility of that pineal gland. The darkness light cycle is what activates it, pineal gland. You also have the pituitary gland, and it's broken out into the intermediate pituitary, anterior, and posterior, which again is kind of super confusing. And then you'll see the hormones that each of those produces underneath that. So oxytocin, that's a very common hormone that people talk about, that feel-good hormone. You also have the ADH, which is the antidiuretic hormone. Those can also be influenced by things like mold toxicity. You've got the vasopressin, and then you've got the anterior pituitary with growth hormone, thyroid stimulating hormone, the TSH, your FSH, your LH, your prolactin, a lot of those key sex hormones that are precursors for a balanced menstrual cycle. And then on the other side, you've got the hypothalamus. So when you hear us talk about the axis, it always starts in the brain, the hypothalamus pituitary thyroid and the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal. And so if that system is disrupted in any area, then we have dysfunction that takes place. Your hypothalamus also secretes oxytocin and vasopressin, as well as things like somatostatin, dopamine, your thyrotropin releasing hormone, growth hormone, yada, yada, yada. So those are just sort of the different hormones that are produced from different parts of the brain. So you have the forebrain, the midbrain, and the either hindbrain or hindbrain. It's kind of pronounced several ways, but it is going to be like a group of experts. So your hindbrain includes the upper part of the spinal cord, the brain stem, and the cerebellum. It controls your respiration, so breathing rate and heart rate. So this is also why when you think about just stress in general, what happens? Breathing either gets more rapid or very slow, hypoventilation, and heart rate can either go really, really high or it can begin to decrease, especially with like excessive cold, which is still a stressor. Your cerebellum coordinates movement and it's involved in learned rote movements. So when you play something like the piano or you hit a tennis ball, you're activating the cerebellum. And in the initial stages of your life, you are providing your brain with a lot of information, which is why a lot of kids nowadays, you know, they did a test, which there's a lot of factors to this, but like lowest IQ scores out there. And what are kids doing nowadays? Ding, 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 devices, video games. They're not playing as much with friends, with sports, with instruments. We've moved away from this and it impacts the cerebellum, which impacts what? Respiration and heart rate. And then the uppermost part of the brainstem is the midbrain, which controls some of your reflexes, eye movements, voluntary movements. It's the largest and most highly developed part. And it consists primarily of your cerebrum and what's hidden beneath it, the inner brain. Are there specific nutrients that affect the pineal gland? Yes, we'll get into those a little bit later. And then the insta of vagus nerve and breathing. So Dr. Stephanie is going to be probably the best for that. Yeah, but not breathing necessarily, but vagus nerve. Okay, so your brain is divided into two halves. You have the, which is the cerebrum. It is the left and the right hemisphere, and they have entirely different functions. So your left side of your brain controls the right side of your body, and the right side of your brain controls the left side of your body. We'll dive into that more here in a little bit because it's absolutely fascinating how they play different functions and roles. And also the fact that when someone has trauma to one side of their brain, you'll notice that not only is like are they susceptible to injuries on that side, but also it impacts the function of what that brain does. So whether it's memory, cognition, mood, you know, depending on where they got hit. So that's essentially it split into two halves. Little thing at the left part here. So it's basically saying that like, if someone were to have a stroke in the right hemisphere of the brain, it will leave the left arm and left leg paralyzed. So it's opposite. So here's a picture of what each side sort of does. You've got the left side where it's your speaking, reading, writing, listening, grammar, number skills, computation skills, analyzing information, reasoning, logic, sequential thinking, time awareness, and it controls the right side of the body. When there's an injury on the left side of the brain, and I did an Instagram post on this last week, you can injure your brain even from chronic stress. It does not mean a concussion or a TBI. It could strictly be from chronic stress or other factors. So that's important to also know. Dr. Ozzie taught me that because after my concussion, he said, you could reconcuss your brain and cause another TBI if you have external life stressors. So control as many factors as you can and like really prioritize lowering your stress levels because that in itself can cause damage to the brain. So when that takes place, the injuries on the left side, it can cause issues with anything that it does, but also sequencing difficulties, verbal memory, changes in speech, difficulty expressing spoken and written language or understanding spoken and written language, and impaired logic. So that's why with some individuals where you're like, how are they not understanding this? Think of the past few years where you're like, I don't understand how they don't get it. Like there's no logic here. And it just also makes me wonder, hey, are they being impacted by EMF, Wi-Fi, mold toxicity, something that is impacting their ability to have reason and logic? The right side of the brain is for organization, abstract meanings, spatial type relationships like map reading or shape recognition, facial recognition, intuition, emotion, imagination. It's more of like living up here in the clouds a little bit. And it's also the really artistic natured people. Controls the left side of the body. Injuries can impair your attention, memory, decreased awareness, loss of like big picture thinking. And then a big one is altered creativity. Another thing I learned from Dr. Ozzie is if you are a musician, you're gonna feed more of your right side, and it can lead to almost left side deficiency is the way he explained it. So there's certain times we'll get into, I think we put the exercises on here. You can do specific exercises that support your weak side of your brain. So I was an athlete, and because of that, he's like, I really want you to take time doing Sudoku puzzles, listening to classical music, drawing, doing things that help the other side. Okay, so if you are right-handed, I'm curious, do we have any lefties in the group? Left-handed people? Let me know in the chat if you're left-handed. I'm really curious to know which of y'all may be. So if you're right-handed, the left hemisphere of your brain will be your dominant side. Remember, there's opposite. And then if you're left-handed, this is where it's interesting. There's only around a 20% chance of the right hemisphere being dominant. So another broader problem here with the idea of being left-brained or right-brained is that while you can isolate certain functions to specific areas, if you overwhelm the hemisphere in the brain and the regions within them, they won't work in isolation of one another. So there's this concept called brain lateralization, and it describes this idea that we have two different hemispheres. Each half is responsible for different tasks and functions. Okay, so Gabrielle and Shay are both left-handed. And when you think about, okay, if I'm left-handed and only about 20% of the right, then y'all may have a little bit more balance, whereas people who are right-handed are more susceptible to a left side dominant, right side brain instability. So here's just some of the associations from each side. Something easy you can do for if you're left-handed or right-handed is when you brush your teeth, use your opposite hand. That's a really helpful tool that helps with your brain. Some people are called ambidextrous. And if you're ambidextrous, that essentially means that you are right-handed and maybe writing, but you play sports with the other hand. So someone might, bat left-handed, or when they ride a snowboard, they are riding goofy, but they're right-handed, and vice versa. So that is ambidextrous, but it's also helpful for them because they're utilizing both sides of their brain often. Researchers have found that for most right-handers, for tasks involving things like language, the left side of the brain is more active than the right, but that has not been the case for most lefties. They exhibit more activity in their right hemisphere for language tasks. Because lefties rely less on the left hemisphere, then they are displaying less brain lateralization as opposed to righties. So super interesting. A little bit about divergent thinking. And then one of the best ways to support the left hemisphere of the brain is Sudoku puzzles. It basically flexes the part of your brain that doesn't get a lot of use in everyday life. Not everyone in their day-to-day gets to be a problem solver. Allie and I are doing that with labs. It's very similar where we're looking at labs like a puzzle. But if we were not in that sphere of our work, like my parents definitely aren't, they would really benefit from something like a Sudoku puzzle. And I always think of my grandpa because he's one of the smartest people I've ever met in my life on both sides, with reason and also with just common sense. And I always want to sit under him and be like, how are you so smart? And he grew up and he was a football coach. And so he very much had that aspect of it, but he did Sudoku puzzles every single day. So every single day, my grandpa does a Sudoku puzzle. So that is one way that you can flex your less dominant side, or the side that doesn't get as much attention. I don't know if Wordle would necessarily help as much. All the studies have been done on Sudoku. I'm sure it might help a little bit, but not sure. There's not like concrete evidence on that. Your brain has different sections as well. They're kind of in different colors. So we'll touch on each of those. It also has the cerebral halves, which is divided into the sections and lobes, you can see. And these are kind of broken down. So the orange part, this is you have essentially two frontal lobes, and they lie directly behind the forehead, which is where they get the name frontal lobe. So when you plan a schedule, when you are imaginative, especially like futuristic thinking, reasoned arguments, apologetics, those two lobes do most of the work. One of the ways that the frontal lobes seem to do these things is by acting on your short-term storage sites, which allows one idea to be kept in the mind while others are being considered. Your motor cortex, highlighted in the blue, in the rearmost portion of each frontal lobe is your motor cortex. This helps plan, control, execute voluntary movement, intentional movement. So whether it's like me literally saying, I want to lift my arm up to lift up this glass of water, or I want to kick a ball, you're using your motor cortex. And then your parietal lobes, this is, let's say you have a really good dinner and the taste, the aroma, the texture, your parietal lobes are at work with that. So reading, it's another function, and repertoire of each parietal lobe. Arithmetic as well. And then you have your somatosensory cortex and lobes. So the forward parts of these lobes are just behind the motor areas, and the occipital lobes are the first part, temporal lobes are the second part. So the red is the occipital, and this helps process images from the eyes. I don't know if y'all have ever heard, but you have your frontal lobe, your eyes are connected to the back part of the head, which is a lot of reasons why when people have like cervical issues, C1, C2 inversions, their vision starts to get impaired. And then it also helps with linking that information with images stored in memory. But if you have damage to the occipital lobe, which almost seems like it shouldn't be because your eyes are in the front, but it's connected, is what can cause blindness. So that's super interesting as well, because a lot of athletes, myself included, when you fall back and hit your head on the ground, you can damage that occipital lobe and it can impact your memory, and it can also impact your vision. Temporal lobes, these lie in front of the visual areas. They're nested under the parietal section and frontal section. And when you are listening to symphonies or rock music, your brain responds through these lobes. Have y'all ever heard like when they say like it's like a folks thing of like when you're pregnant or when you have a baby to play classical music and like soothing music, it can help support some of these lobes in the brain and help the brain develop. But at the top of each temporal lobe is an area responsible for receiving information through the ears. And that's sort of when you think about where the brain is, where your ears are, and the underside of each lobe plays a crucial role in forming and retrieving memories as well. But it's also strongly associated with music. So think about how you hear music, right? Through your ears. You're not really going to taste music necessarily. All right, the inner brain, hypothalamus, thalamus, hippocampus, and basal ganglia. So your hypothalamus, you can kind of see this picture here if I scroll in. They're just the small little parts at sort of the center of the brain. The hypothalamus is green, the thalamus is yellow, and the hippocampus is purple. So the hypothalamus is about the size of a pearl. So wee little bitty, but it has tons of functions. It's what wakes you up in the morning. It helps get your adrenaline flowing, whether you're, trying to go speak on stage, or you're about to take a test, or you're about to interview for a job. It controls emotions. So it can dictate whether you feel angry or happy or unhappy or exhilarated. So that's the hypothalamus. Near that is the thalamus, which is sort of a clearinghouse of information to go to and from the spinal cord and the cerebrum. And then you have an arching tract of nerve cells that leads from the hypothalamus to the thalamus to the hippocampus. It's just a tiny little nub that acts as a memory indexer. And then you have the basal ganglia, which are not on here, but they're clusters of nerve cells surrounding the thalamus, and they are responsible for things like tremors, rigidity, stiffness, shuffling, walk. Like Tourette's would probably fall in that camp as well. All right.
Also, a fun fact. So this is like the problem when Emily and I say that it takes us a while to do this stuff is we go on these like rabbit holes of things that all of a sudden now I'm like deep in research on REM sleep. I'm trying to do the brain. So anyways, I didn't want to like have a whole tangent on this, but I thought it was really interesting because the first thing I thought of is like, since Emily and I, as you guys know too, also love looking at like our aura ring for like sleep stages and things, like what part of the brain, if we're looking at like, you know, how root causes affect things, whatever. But like for REM sleep, so during most stages of sleep, the thalamus, it becomes quiet and it lets you tune out the external world. But during REM sleep, the thalamus is active and it sends the cortex images, sounds, and other sensations that fill our dream. So that's pretty cool. I didn't really realize like the thalamus. I mean, you know, the hypothalamus, you hear about all these things, but like REM sleep is such an important part of our everyday, and the thalamus is in charge of that.
Yes. The brain obviously is a huge part of sleep, but fun facts.
Yeah. The
Fun
more you
fact.
know.
Okay, this is a really important slide when it comes to root cause. Very, very, very important slide. So the brain and the rest of the nervous system are composed of types of cells. And the primary functional unit is called a neuron of the cell. So whether it's sensations, movements, thoughts, memories, feelings, results of signals that pass through the neurons, it's the cell, the body, the dendrites, and axon. You'll probably remember drawing this in elementary school. And the direction of the nerve signal goes from the cell, body, and dendrites with the axon in the middle and the myelin sheath that covers it to the terminal areas. This can get disrupted due to things like Lyme disease that goes in and disrupts this nerve signaling process. Injuries can disrupt this process. So, you know, when we hear the word demyelination, that's a very common result of root causes. It's the body breaking down, essentially. So when we think of even like the brain and the rest of the nervous system, they are composed of what? They're all composed of cells. I think that Allie and I this year, that was like our biggest focus with y'all, is really supporting the cell health, which y'all know what we're going to say. What is one of the number one things that supports overall, if you had to pick one, the cell? We always talk about it. We love it. We take it every day. PC, yes. So why do you think people with demyelination and multiple sclerosis have such incredible testimonies with PC? Because it's supporting these cells. It's supporting that myelin sheath as well, which is a what? Fatty molecule. Your brain needs what to function? Fat, and the ability for it to be digestible. So healthy fats are essential, not only for like overcoming root causes, but having healthy cells and healthy myelin sheaths. So it's what makes you who you are. And it's very, very, very important and gets disrupted pretty easily. You also have the synapse, which is, this one is a little bit more confusing, but if you can look at the receptor sites and neurotransmitters in vehicles, those are kind of part of the synapse. So this is where your signals pass from neurons to other cells. So when it reaches the end of that axon that we just talked about, it stimulates the release of these things called vesicles. You can kind of see them. They're in little circles, but they're tiny little pink dots. And these are what release our neurotransmitters. What are some neurotransmitters y'all think of when I say the word neurotransmitters? Do we know? You can even think of the word neuro, brain, transmitter. What is the responsibility of those? Dopamine, serotonin, yes. It's essentially information. That's what it's doing. It's a mood response and it's information. It's sending it from one place to another. So going backwards, if we have poor myelin sheath, we have broken communication. So that's one of the reasons they say PC helps your cells communicate. This is why. and send the right signals to and from cells all throughout the body. So neurotransmitters are chemicals that brain cells use to talk to each other. That's essentially what they are. They're walkie-talkies. Some neurotransmitters make cells more active, which are your excitatory ones, while others block or dampen, which are called inhibitory. You need both. You don't want it to be too excitatory. Like if you have dopamine, you feel great. If you have too much dopamine, not great. Same thing with inhibitory. Inhibitory is great, but too little, not great. So here is a list of key neurotransmitters. It's not all of them. Y'all listed dopamine and serotonin in the chat. Those are two of them at the very bottom. So we'll start with those. Serotonin is a neurotransmitter that constricts blood vessels, and it's what brings on sleep. It's involved in temperature regulation. It's very key for overall melatonin production. If we don't have enough serotonin, we can not only have sleep problems and depression, but we can also just feel really low mood, no motivation. We don't want to work out. Well, too much, too excitatory, that can lead to seizures. So it's either one way or the other. Dopamine, this is an inhibitory neurotransmitter with mood and the control of complex movements. If we lose dopamine in some portions of the brain, this can lead to things like Parkinson's disease. Many medications are used to treat behavioral disorders by working on dopamine of the brain. This is very common with, anxiety, for example. So if we, have too much going on, then they work to reduce that with things like SSRIs, for example, or sleep medication. Acetylcholine, this is an excitatory neurotransmitter. It generally makes your cells more excited. It governs muscles contracting, causes glands to secrete hormones. And if you don't have enough, it can lead to things like Alzheimer's. Notice that all of these diseases are diseases that affect what? The brain. Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, these key diseases are influenced through neurotransmitters, which are made and chemicals that come from our cells, which is why this is the whole idea of all health begins at a cellular level. Glutamate, this is an major excitatory transmitter. If we have too much, it can actually kill and damage neurons that have been linked to things like Parkinson's, stroke, seizures, increased pain sensitivity, and then GABA. This is a very calming one. Now, here's what's interesting about GABA. I didn't have all the details for my post last week, but I've been researching GABA, and GABA should not cross the blood-brain barrier. So if GABA works, what is that a key clue for? If GABA is great, it means there's leaky brain, because GABA should not be able to cross the blood-brain barrier. So Dr. Karizian speaks about this a lot. He has something called a GABA challenge that you can look up. And it is basically taking a certain amount of GABA, and in the way that the body responds, it's a clue for, hey, we need to seal up the brain. The brain is leaky. If there is also situations of things like Huntington's disease or tremors, they'll have drugs that will increase GABA levels in the brain to treat those things. A lot of kids do have excess glutamate. And do you know what they put in almost all the packages of food? Does anyone know the ingredient?
Oh, sorry.
What?
I just said what it was.
Yeah, MSG.
MSG.
Monosodium glutamate, which is so detrimental to the brain. It drives up glutamate in the brain, and it's in literally almost all processed foods. Almost all processed foods have MSG. And I think it's similar where unless it reaches a certain threshold, they don't have to put it on the label. It's very common in ranch, very common in Chinese food. Those are probably two of the highest sources. Do you know of any other common sources, Al?
Yeah, I've looked it up a handful of times and I never remember because I've always been like, oh, he doesn't eat any of those foods, so it's okay. I think there's some that are just like random foods. Like I can't remember if potatoes is honestly one of them. But look up like lists of glutamate high in glutamate foods. It's usually not an issue if you're not eating only things of that nature. But the problem is too with when it comes to like spectrum disorder things is like a lot of kids will have very, very specific picky eating. And so they tend to act, the glutamate is acting as like a drug is the best way to describe it. It's basically like firing up their brain where it's almost they're getting this like dopamine hit from it. So that's the food that they want to continue to. Same thing with like fast food, speaking of fast food and MSG or Chinese food, it's like this immediate drug to the system to where it increases all of these excitatory things and it feels really good. And that's what it's doing inside your brain. But things like melatonin and B6. Those are all, super helpful things to reduce that glutamate. So it's basically just reducing the foods first and then having all those cofactors that are going to help reduce that brain inflammation.
Yep. And that's glutamate foods, but
Yeah.
MXG is like a preservative, monosodium.
High in glutamate. Yeah.
Different things. Yeah. All right. So then you have your brain hormones, pituitary gland, hypothalamus. They're like orchestra conductors. So their job is to tell, and why we wanted to do the reproductive and endocrine style system tonight is it comes from the brain. So this is why hormones are influenced from the function of the brain. And this is why just going after hormones or just detoxing estrogen won't necessarily help if you're not fixing it as an upstream issue. Two of the biggest drivers for disruptions, and three of the biggest drivers for disruptions of the entire cascaded system is chronic stress and high cortisol, blood sugar dysregulation, and nutrient deficiencies. So those things impact the brain. The brain then disrupts pretty much everything else because of cellular communication. Sleep and fertility. Pineal glands is important for sleep cycle, regulation of female reproductive hormone with fertility and menstrual cycles. We kind of touched on ADH earlier, but lack of ADH will cause increased urination, waking up in the middle of the night to pee. It's also called vasopressin. It regulates the sodium levels and water balance. It's highly disrupted from adrenal stress. And when it is way too low, it can actually lead to something called diabetes insipidus. TSH, this is different than thyroid stimulating hormone. It's a different one. It's produced in the hypothalamus and stimulates the release of the thyroid gland to produce thyroid hormones. Too much TSH will cause hyper, too little will cause hypo. So thyrotropin and then thyroid stimulating. Brain hormones continue. Those are just another list of ones. I don't think we'll need that slide. Okay, so then we have brain hormones and fertility, and I'll zoom in on some of these. So we have HCG. This is measured, very commonly measured with pregnancy. So if you are about, you'll notice between 5 and 10 weeks, that's when HCG is surging. It's produced by the placenta after implantation. So it supports the function of the corpus luteum, which is a temporary structure in the ovaries essential in early pregnancy. So this is what they measure to detect is somebody pregnant, is these HCG levels. Then you have progesterone, which we spoke about in the past. This is produced in the early stages of pregnancy by the corpus luteum. And then by the time you're starting to get to, it starts being made by the placenta around week 10, but it's starting to rapidly increase around weeks 25, 30, 35, and then it begins to fall before it gets to 40 weeks. And it inhibits contraction of the uterus so that it grows as the baby does, strengthens the pelvic wall muscles for labor. Then you have oestrogen, which helps the uterus grow, maintains its lining, helps fetal organs develop, activates, regulates production of other hormones. And then with progesterone, this is important for breast growth and milk duct development. Oxytocin produced by the pituitary gland. And you'll notice that, this is what, actually, Ali, I want you to speak on this because it's basically like what's triggering prostaglandins for contractions of labor. And you've been through that twice, so.
Yeah, so basically when, oxytocin is the hormone that is like considered kind of like your happy hormone or your love hormone. Oxytocin is released in like climactic, climax is, whatever you want to call it. And also it's basically what helps the uterus open up, or helps the uterus contract and constrict to where then basically, baby is coming out and the opening of the vagina, all the things, it's dilating. It's what causes dilation as a overall arching theme. But the main thing that will shut it down is stress.
Yeah.
And so the super, super important part is, especially in labor, is many people will go into a scenario thinking they're going to have a certain type of birth and certain type of labor, but it really is going to depend on what that person feels comfortable with, because you can all of a sudden get to the hospital and your labor shuts down because your body is perceived stress. You don't like hospital settings. Your oxytocin is literally like, okay, we're done now. And that's what is stalling labor most of the time, is that inhibition of oxytocin. It's also what stimulates breast milk production, or like a letdown, like when your breast milk is coming in. So what's an interesting correlation is if like someone has maybe like an unexpected C-section and they have kind of like that trauma or that extra layer of stress and maybe some medication, their milk production can actually be delayed because of like the lack or the lag in that oxytocin production. And even to stimulate labor or to like induce labor, basically what people are doing is they're stimulating an oxytocin response and elevating that oxytocin.
Yep. I think another important thing when we think about the menstrual cycle is a key thing here says it stimulates contractions of uterine muscles and triggers production of something called prostaglandins, which is going to increase contractions. When people have really severe menstrual cramps in their front side or back side, the reason why is a release of prostaglandins. It's causing these contractions, and that's very common with nutrient deficiencies, and it's very common with things like cysts and fibroids. So that's also, we've had a lot of people go through the program even recently say, oh my gosh, like I didn't have cramps. I had a pretty great menstrual cycle. And it's probably because stress levels have come down. There aren't as much prostaglandins released, or you were able to dissolve or support the elimination of things like cysts or fibroids. And then you have an easier menstrual cycle as a result. Relaxin. So this inhibits the uterus contraction to prevent premature birth. And it relaxes blood vessels, increases blood flow to the placenta and kidneys, and relaxes the joints of the pelvis. So this is basically like softening and lengthening the cervix during birth, and then it'll obviously decrease after pregnancy. And then the last one on this page is prolactin. So this is the main hormone needed to produce breast milk, which is a good thing of prolactin, but if somebody has high prolactin and isn't pregnant, that is usually a hormone imbalance and stress response, because it will also increase due to stress. And progesterone will inhibit lactation during the pregnancy period, whereas, progesterone will drastically fall. If you can kind of see over here, look, progesterone tanks around after week 40, which is also why females lose hair postpartum. Well, guess what? One of the most crucial things postpartum that women are depleted in, that's needed for decreasing that drop and keeping progesterone at a good place, and also helping with postpartum depression. Posted about today, B6. B6 is absolutely essential for that process to keep the hormones balanced and the progesterone happy. And B6 is also a precursor to pretty much all of these neurotransmitters we're talking about. Serotonin is a big one. So B6 most commonly depleted due to the same 3 reasons as why the brain gets disrupted: chronic stress, nutrient deficiencies, blood sugar dysregulation. All right, moving on. This is just a cool chart that also shows how even some of your cell types are influencing the hormones that are produced. So if you look even at the top, you have the anterior pituitary gland that's breaking down into, we'll start on the right, the LH surge for ovulation. Ovulation is what produces progesterone, produces testosterone. So if you do not have an LH surge, you are not ovulating, you are not producing sufficient progesterone. You have the basophils. So we talk about basophils often with being, a parasite marker and a mast cell marker. And so if someone has parasites or mast cell issues, this can get disrupted where they're not making sufficient FSH or LH, which that can then disrupt the proper production of estrogen, maturation of the follicles and ovaries, which is essential for pregnancy as well. You also have PRL and TSH, so milk production, and then production of thyroid hormones. So this is also why when someone has a ton of mast cells, they tend to have low thyroid function due to this result. Same thing with ACTH, so basophils, mast cell marker. You're not going to have as much ACTH. You'll usually see low ACTH on blood work, and that is essential for DHEA, which starts then the whole process of testosterone, estrogen, progesterone, and MSH, which is producing melanin, which is skin pigment. And then we've talked about before, mast cells, you start to see loss of even pigment in some of the skin or sun sensitivity. And then you have human growth hormone for bodybuilding, tissue repair, which is a different type of cell.
The interesting thing about like all those hormones, when you think about the most common things that you hear of that people experience postpartum, is when we think about postpartum depression, postpartum anxiety, hair loss, potential hypothyroid, and maybe lack of milk supply, low libido. Like these are all things that make sense when you look at that cascade of hormones of like, if one of those isn't firing, then all of the rest like cannot play off of each other. And so things like a stress or a trauma, a birth trauma, antibiotics, or things that maybe didn't, go as planned that you wouldn't have normally done. Your body has to clear that. Maybe there's blockages in your detox pathways, or it's simply things like B6 and minerals and hypothyroid, which is then affecting the prolactin. So there's always like an underlying kind of common theme. It's just so unfortunate that I think in today's age, many people, probably not like in our sphere, but like most people just accept like, oh, I have postpartum depression, or like, oh, I have postpartum hair loss, that's part of it, or like, oh, milk supply is low, no big deal, I'll just supplement. But it's like, really, if you go back and look at all those hormones we just talked about, it's pretty easy to figure out like where's the hang up in that whole process and chain reaction. If you can figure out where that is, then none of those things should actually be normal.
Yep. So good. Okay, so looking at this chart, I know we've done hormones before, but just out of curiosity, where do y'all experience, you can put it in the chat because we can speak to these time periods, the biggest issues during your cycle, if you are currently menstruating or have in the past? From the start of the cycle to day 28. Some people have like a 35-day cycle. That's okay too. Okay, so ovulation, 2 days before, after ovulation, second half, progesterone issue for sure. Give me 1 second. Keep typing things. Hey, buddy, you're gonna have to go. Come on.
And I'm curious too, if anybody has had maybe like a change in like before kids or after pregnancy. Has this shifted? Like, has the issue shifted?
Week before, week of. Okay. So I want to cover some of these areas. So let's just start with the start of your cycle. The start of your cycle is the day you start bleeding. That's day 1. And at this time, if you are noticing just a lot of cramps, then go back to what we said earlier about prostaglandins. There could be an excessive amount of prostaglandins. With miscarriages, this can happen. The fibroids are secreting prostaglandins at random times, and it causes that miscarriage. And then also we have to think about even like hormones need nutrients, right? So if there is anemia going on, then that blood that you're losing, have less blood to deliver to cells and tissues, which is oxygen. And think about what oxygen does for the system. So this is where during this time period, like we need iron, we need red meat, we need these things that are going to really help support anemia and the blood. So that's really, really, really essential in that window. And resting, remember, that's the time period where we want to rest. We want to eat probably lower carb because we're more insulin resistant, but resting, like no exercising, lots of just relaxing, baths, staying warm, going back to what we talked about in the deeper call of hormones to really support that phase. So once you go from sort of the end of your period to day 7-ish to day 14, this is considered kind of the follicular phase up to ovulation. Your body is like, at this time, most people feel good. I don't think I saw anyone that said that they didn't feel good at this time. Yeah, I don't see anyone. But this is typically when people feel good. Estrogen's starting to rise. You're coming from a low estrogen to a higher estrogen. You become more insulin sensitive. You can handle more carbs, high intensity workouts. You're not holding as much water. This is usually a time that people feel pretty good. But as you start creeping up to ovulation, 1 to 2 days before and day of, what usually happens is now estrogen's too high. You're surging too high because you are already sort of estrogen dominant, which makes histamine worse. It makes pain higher. You don't feel hot. You're experiencing all the estrogen dominant symptoms. So this is a time period where people don't feel ideal. And it usually means, looking at this chart, that they have probably too much LH, which is surged in excess from stress and blood sugar challenges. PCOS is a very common reason that will surge, as well as excess estrogen, which can also be from blood sugar, histamine, stress, blood sugar imbalances, excess testosterone that gets aromatized into estrogen. So it's really key here to eat cooked cruciferous vegetables, raw carrots, supporting the proper elimination through things like artichoke and drainage essentials. And I like that it's at a smaller dose. For some of y'all, you could take a higher dose, but then that can cause weight gain because it could back up other places. So we really like taurine and artichoke, and Schisandra is great, Endo Supreme for that ovulatory period, and then eating lower histamine in general. So that's kind of that phase. So, all right. So then after ovulation, you start getting into like the first part of your luteal phase. And this is when like you got to relax, because think about what the body's truly doing in this phase. Progesterone's starting to increase. So if you're stressed and you're over exercising and you're not sleeping well and you're overworking, you're going to stunt that production. And when you have not enough progesterone in this section, you're not going to feel good. You're going to have a very painful menstrual cycle. It's not going to be great. It could even come early. There could be mid-cycle spotting. And the reason why is because when we're stressed in this phase, that progesterone turns into cortisol, and excess cortisol depletes progesterone. So ovulation to day 21, like no high intensity exercise. It should be relaxing. I wouldn't even push high weight training, because the body in this phase is saying, am I going to implant and get pregnant? And so we have to support that phase, even if pregnancy is not our goal, because that's the natural rhythm of hormones. So we got to chill. 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 Also, right after ovulation, some people can drop in estrogen too fast. They're so high and they drop so fast that can trigger headaches, migraines, pain, inflammation, poor sleep, hot flashes, all sorts of things. Because the higher something goes, the deeper it falls. So rosemary can be really helpful for that. Basically everything I just mentioned with like the higher estrogen in relation to progesterone, rosemary. I love the herb, cooking it. Like some of y'all even put that on your plan. Use rosemary to cook your potatoes and other herbs and things. All right. And then the final time, days 21 to 28, this is when PMS, this is your PMS window. And typically it's because your progesterone is falling. That's the most common reason. And so if you are having PMS, all it means is your hormones are not good. PMS means bad hormones, and it's all influenced through all the previous days that led up to the PMS period. So there is a conversion issue. There's either too much estrogen, not enough progesterone, LH isn't surging at the right time. You're not having an FSH surge. Things are falling too rapidly. There's not enough production. And so we have to, that phase of PMS is responsible, or is a result of everything that took place leading up to it. So part of this is also, we have to have good eggs. You know, we have to have good eggs. PMS is the week before your period, days 21 to 28. And so in order to have quality mucus and quality eggs, do you know what vitamin you need? And nourishing and protecting the egg in this period? B6. You need B6 again. So that is why when you look up B6 in general, one of the most common things it does is reduce PMS. So B6, very, 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 very important, especially if you get cramps like in your lower belly, B6, 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 B6. Okay, so moving on from this. Okay. Yeah, I think that's it. All right, so moving on. And I know Christine mentioned it too about chaste tree. Chaste tree is also great for progesterone and ovulation. So I like that too. Shatavari is another good one. Okay. Sleep problems, insomnia. This is an indicator that the brain has become toxic. So when people are having sleep problems, brain needs support. Brain needs help in different ways. So then you also have emotions that play a role. Chronic fear can contribute to chronic sympathetic nervous system dominance, stimulation that leads to issues with the HPA axis. and that can lead to prolonged elevation of cortisol levels, which can reduce neurogenesis, connectivity, neuroplasticity in the brain. Brain fog, mood changes, poor memory, or cognitive function focus is the body's way of saying, hey, the brain is inflamed, because your brain doesn't have pain fibers. So when your brain is on fire, Dr. Bob uses that a lot, it's not going to create actual joint pain and headaches. That's not how the brain works. If there's headaches, there's a circulatory issue. There's a hormonal imbalance issue. Those symptoms are when the brain is saying I'm inflamed. So brain fog, brain's inflamed. Like that's what it's saying. Mood disruptions, brain's inflamed. Memory, cognition, brain's inflamed. So you need essential nutrients in order for that to take place. So again, blood sugar, stress, nutrients, 3 biggest ones. And any stress or physical or much emotional can cause brain issues. These are ways to increase your happy hormones for the brain. You've got your dopamine, you've got meditation, to-do list, long-term goal setting, L-tyrosine rich foods, exercise, writing, playing, dancing. You've got serotonin, cold showers, sunlight, massage, protein and carb snacks, exercise, endorphins, which is going to be laughing, crying, creating music, dark chocolate, spicy foods, exercise, massage, meditation, and then oxytocin, physical touch, socializing, massage, acupuncture, cold shower, meditation, listening music. And yeah, PC is great for the brain. Very good. So testing, these are options for the brain specifically, like it'll actually tell you what's going on with the leakiness. This should say Cyrex, not Pyrex. Did I send you Pyrex, Allie?
Yeah, you did. And I didn't.
I bet you Google auto-corrected it. Because I'm like, oh, that's interesting. Okay, so Cyrex Array 20, you'll need a functional medicine doc to order that. We're trying to get them on Vexia, but they're not there yet. Or the neural zoomer. And then you can have clues through things like OAT, EGG, MRIs, mycotoxin, HTMAs, blood work, things like that.
Yeah, some of the ones are newer to me. Like, I don't know if anyone's more familiar than I am with an EEG. I don't even remember what it stands for, but essentially it's probably for adults too, but in seizures, going back to that, with that really, really excess excitatory, the EEG can actually monitor if the brain is having silent seizures that are not being like physical, that you wouldn't ever notice. So sometimes when people are kind of just like all of a sudden like has this like glazed donut look, or like really staring off in and kind of just like, whoa, what happened? The brain can actually be having these silent seizures. So the EEG is something to test for that, which I just learned about.
That is super cool.
Yeah, as you all probably assume, I'm taking a very deep dive on brain as it relates to also, kids specifically and all of that. So yeah, it's my wheelhouse right now.
Yes, you learn so much in the process.
Yeah.
The testing, in addition to the other tests, you can have clues through blood work and micronutrient testing. So like choline, absolutely essential. It's why in pregnancy, like for the baby's brain development, choline is so important. Even CoQ10, so important. B1, so important. Like the B vitamins just in general are absolutely essential. B6, B9, B12, iodine, this is for normal brain development and function as well. Iodine deficiency is considered the most common cause of preventable brain damage in the world. The thyroid gland is also needed for, or the iodine is also needed for the thyroid gland, which, is controlled by the pituitary. Electrolytes, these help make sure your nerves, muscles, heart, and brain work the way they should. So when you're looking at sodium, potassium, we want those optimal. Running a hair tissue mineral analysis test is a good way to see those alongside micronutrient testing. Looking at your cholesterol. So, we don't hear about low cholesterol as much, but if you don't have enough total cholesterol, LDL, VLDL, then you're not going to be able to make hormones, cell membranes, and brain cells. Ceruloplasmin, that's a marker we've spoken on before. That's a good copper marker. And low blood ceruloplasmin can actually lead to iron accumulation in neural and glial cells of the brain, as well as pancreatic insulin-producing cells and liver cells. Ceruloplasmin is essentially what's going to help with copper utilization, but it's vitamin A in the form of retinol that loads that copper into that enzyme. And a lot of people are low in vitamin A. And if that's not working, then we don't have proper iron utilization. So you can see the iron panel shift in different directions. And then melatonin for embryo quality and the cells of ovaries. And melatonin also helps the brain detoxify. Glutathione is not enough. You really need melatonin. It's largely why people don't feel great when they start taking it. ALT is more liver, AST is more skeletal, but it's also found in other tissues like the brain. And then LDH. LDH is a really good indicator of acute or chronic tissue damage, and it's largely found in areas, not only the heart, liver, but also the brain. So when you start seeing high LDH, that can also be another indicator for brain. HTMA is a hair test, and it's not going to give you things like vitamins. It's only some of your minerals, and it'll point to heavy metals that are coming out. Micronutrients are going to give you your amino acids, your fatty acids, your vitamins, your minerals. It's a different spectrum, but certain minerals, and especially the ratios of minerals, because you have to look at it from a hair test. You want to look at a hair test for the ratios. So also a hair test, if it's high or low on a hair test, you don't know if cellularly you're actually low. You don't know if it's being just, you can't absorb it in the body. So we don't run HTMAs very often when we're really looking at like, what are the nutrient statuses doing? We like micronutrient panels better.
I did learn about, because Emily, we had talked about this, but the test that Muscles and Motherhood, I can never remember her real name. Margaret. In addition to a few other practitioners that I talked to when running an HTMA, if you wanted to do that, they both like something called trace elements is the test that they like to run for HTMA. Just out of curiosity, if anyone's wondering, trace elements.
For iron recycling issue, is it ever a high copper? Not always. If you're seeing high copper, it's that your body isn't utilizing that copper probably. And so like ceruloplasmin can elevate due to inflammation and stress. So usually it's more of that versus an actual copper indicator if it's high. All right, so this is the human reproductive system. We are at 519. We can go through this quickly. We won't go as in depth, but you have the male organs on the left and the female organs on the right. So it has different parts to it. So you have the fallopian tubes, uterus, ovaries, endometrium, cervix, vagina, and the little tail things at the bottom for the female organs. And then for males, you've got the prostate's a big part of the overall male organ function, but you'll notice that the bladder is also included in there for them, the urethra, the penis, the testicles. So females and males are obviously going to operate a little bit differently. You know, we're designed very different in this way when it comes to overall organ function. So you've got key nutrients. Here's another plug for B6. So zinc is a very big one for both females and males. Zinc is what's going to help your pituitary gland release FSH and encourage ovulation. So also tell your ovaries to produce more progesterone, just in case you become pregnant each month. And then some good food sources. B6 with the cervical mucus, it can help move sperm to the right places. Allie, I don't know what's clicking in your computer. There's like some.
Sorry, it's me answering the questions.
Oh, I'm like,
I'm sorry.
Noise. And then also it's very helpful in supporting the luteal part of your face. We talked about that second half, which is when your uterine wall thickens, it prepares for the embryo to implant. So if you don't have enough B6, what do you think is going to happen? That embryo is not going to be able to implant. Methylation, very key there. It helps lower things like homocysteine. It can lower things like estrogen dominance because it helps increase progesterone, which helps with the delicate balance between the two, helps your bodies make multiple neurotransmitters like we talked about. When you look at a Dutch test, it can encourage the estrogen to move towards 2-OH instead of 16-OH, which both decreases cancer risk to get estrogen out of the body. It's essential in the corpus luteum, which is the gland produced in the ovary after the egg has been released. It's what helps make progesterone. And then having low levels of B6 can also impact egg quality. So B6, very, very, very important for overall reproduction. And then some other nutrients. So riboflavin, this is needed to be able to utilize and change B6 and folate into the forms that can actually be used. More stuff on B6. Riboflavin is also required in the synthesis of niacin from tryptophan. B3 and B6 are also helpful for cellular communication. And then serotonin, which we kind of already talked about, a little bit of repeat material there. Here are things for egg quality and some hormonal herbs we love. So selenium can decrease risk of miscarriage. If you look at T3 uptake and it's low, then it's a need for usually selenium and iodine. Those are really important. Your B vitamins, iron, because it helps build the blood. Your fat soluble vitamins, A, D, E, and K. Vitamin C, inositol, alpha-lipoic acid, carnitine, NAC, chaste tree, chromium, ovarian reserves, DHE, and CoQ10 are helpful. So yeah, choline would probably be on that list as well. So that is essential for females' reproductive system and egg quality. And then for the hormonal supports that we love, those are probably the top 5: chaste tree, schisandra, rosemary, artichoke, and shatavari. Shatavari is great for both males and females as well. And then this kind of breaks down more into the roles of each of those nutrients for female fertility. We'll give you all these slides, but just kind of gives you the explanation of why it's helpful, as well as male fertility and why it's helpful. Zinc is a really big one because EMF and alcohol deplete zinc, and most men are with AirPods at the gym and drinking beer. So when that happens, testosterone tanks, and that reduces sperm count, and that makes it really hard to have a baby with fertility. And then you also factor in things like your fat soluble vitamins. If they are having alcohol and it's decreasing liver function, they're not going to break down their fat soluble vitamins, A, D, E, and then also K, which is needed for deabsorption. And lower D count, usually they have slower sperm, and that can impact the release of enzymes to allow fusion with an egg. Overall antioxidant status, minerals, CoQ10. So nutrients are important. They're very, very, very important. I've had just a lot of people say, yeah, I flooded my body with nutrients.
Needed, actually, our favorite prenatal Needed also makes a male multi that I think is great. So if your person is going to take one thing, which in my experience, they may only take one thing. I know there's some other people who have shared oh, he'll take whatever I give him. That's great. I'm jealous, but they do make a really good kind of multivitamin for men.
That is so good to know. All right, so I want to pull this all together and show you guys a lab and really explain kind of how this all ties into one another. So hormone imbalances are a big health concern. I'll share in a second. Mood swings worse at ovulation and right before period. So it's that window right before the period. Sleep disturbances, high cortisol. Okay. So those are key things. And then celiac diagnosis is also part of the equation. So I'm going to show you guys how this can look on a lab, going back to what I mentioned about need for B6, as well as how things like iron can be disrupted. So when we look at this iron panel, you see that you have a low UIBC with a high iron. So what are some things that can cause this? Number one, poor conversion. Copper's not being utilized properly to get the iron to where it needs to go. Iron's building up in the tissues. Heavy metals can also cause this. History of high copper on a hair test, which high copper on a hair test does not necessarily mean you have copper excess and toxicity, but rather the body is leaving it out of the hair because it has nothing to load it into ceruloplasmin, which is vitamin A in the form of retinol, which comes from animal products. So without enough animal products and the proper digestion of animal products, we will not properly utilize copper, which means we will not properly utilize iron. So that's just an important tidbit. Then we look down and we think, okay, so we have a copper and vitamin A situation going on. And I'm like, I wonder what ceruloplasmin is, knowing that, right? And we see that it's what? Low. So we have low ceruloplasmin here, which means we need copper. But it's not, hey, let's take more copper, let's take beef liver. It's we need better absorption of it. So what do you need? You need vitamin A, animal products, form of retinol. You also need B6, based on everything we just said on what B6 does with neurotransmitter production, bile production, proper utilization of other nutrients. So I want to show y'all all the places we see that we don't have enough B6. First place, I look down, magnesium red blood cells, or too low. This does not mean take more magnesium because look at the serum level, 2.2. We cannot get magnesium into the cell. What's needed to get magnesium into the cell? Taurine. And what's needed to make taurine and what's needed to be able to shuttle the magnesium into cells to absorb it, the magnesium is B6. So you need B6 to absorb magnesium. You need taurine to shuttle it into the cells. So taurine, magnesium. And then you go up, you won't be able to make glutathione without enough B6, and GGT is low here. You'll also have immune dysfunction. Antibodies will increase. In the presence of stress, you'll burn through B6 faster, which will cause all of this to also go in the direction you don't want. It'll throw off insulin signaling and elevate blood sugar, create more insulin resistance, and it'll drive up homocysteine. And we see it's at a 9.2. And you need both PC and B6 to properly methylate to be able to detox. So when people look at this, you know, they may look at this at the top and think, I have hemochromatosis. I need to go give blood. No, then we have more anemia happening. We don't deliver oxygen to tissues, then the body can't heal. And then they look down here and see red blood cell magnesium is low. Let me take more magnesium. Well, no, we need B6 to be able to absorb it. B6 is also needed to be able to absorb folate. And so people will have low folate red blood cells and take folate, which then can create a B12 deficiency. And what do you need to be able to absorb B12? B6. So that is why it's my favorite vitamin for so many reasons, but most people are low post-COVID. We've seen that time and time again. And I think part of the reason why is they cranked up all the 5G, and EMF has a direct impact on depleting B6 in the body. So unfortunately, we can't control the fact that there's 5G and EMF, but we know everyone in this group what the agenda is at play. If you really look at it, they do not want people reproducing. They just don't. So when you really look at that and you see that, and we have friends with different testing methods who say that B6 is coming up for pretty much everybody right now. And then you can't absorb magnesium. It's just a whole mess. So when in doubt, B6 for the brain. Hey, we made it through on good timing now.
I know.
We did good. But a lot of information.
I refrained from trying to add a lot of commentary because otherwise we'd be here till 4 o'clock.
I know. Anything else though that you can think of?
No. I think at some point, I'll do like a whole, well, and maybe it's in our different membership or whatever, but different slides and things as it relates to like kids and brain and all that kind of stuff, because I have a lot of really cool things to add to it, including some testing and stuff like that and sharing our experience. But I didn't think it was a good time to add that side stuff into this, even though it's brain related. It's a whole other topic.
Do you want to do it next week?
Maybe.
Okay. Be good.
Yeah.
Be good.
Yeah. I'll think about it. If I can wrap my head around doing it, I will try.
With PS100, I would still say PC. It's got phosphatidylserine in it. That would be my recommendation. Yeah, we'll re-upload the replay or upload the replay.
Yeah. And again, the dose for PC, we've talked about it a lot. I got a lot of questions about PC this weekend. Justine Stanger is one of the nutritionists for Body Bio. She does things really, really hard and heavy, I think. She was saying that a lot of the kids that she doses with PC, she'll do upwards of 2 tablespoons a day, and doing just 1/8 teaspoon is not nearly enough. But Emily and I, you know, we always start things slow. I still say go in with that smaller dose if you're, or for yourself, because there's a lot of people that, you know, don't do well with it right off the bat. It starts to detox the brain. So go up slowly, and everybody's maintenance dose or like therapeutic dose is going to be so different. Like, I can never remember her name either. The other gal from Body Bio with MS. Ashley. I mean, she takes, what did she say? Like 4 tablespoons or something?
Sometimes
2 tablespoons
more,
maintenance.
she takes 2 maintenance, and then she'll crank it up for other times in seasons.
Yeah. Or there was a case study that Justine shared with a kid with autism that's doing 4 tablespoons a day. Like that is a lot. So it's a wide variety of how much your body specifically is going to need. But I would say, yeah, 1 teaspoon, 1 tablespoon, probably a good amount. Start slow.
Well, and
Yeah,
I
yeah.
think I mentioned this last week, but I had a client who came to me, and she knows her stuff, but she's been detoxing for years and years and years and years and years. And all of her labs screamed. I mean, she came to me with probably 15 functional labs that our doctors run over the past 2 years. And everything screamed, your cells need support. You need PC. And she was like, there's no way I'm going to feel anything from this. Like, I've been doing stuff for years. She had really high levels of Pseudomonas on her, it was either her organic acid test or her stool test. I don't know. She had a ton of labs. But her VLDL was low, and she's like, Emily, I've never had such bad body odor in my life. I feel like a teen boy going through puberty. She's like, I just ate a bunch of onions. Like, I reek. I'm like, your cells are detoxing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How do you know if you should increase your dose?
I would experiment with it for a week, because I was taking, I think, half a teaspoon as my maintenance dose. And I'm currently at like 2 teaspoons a day. Don't notice a difference yet. We'll see. I'm
Yeah.
actually going to do, this will be good for y'all to know, I'm actually doing the Body Bio red blood cell test. I think they're going to bring it back to practitioners, which really gives you a picture of your cells. So I'll do mine and share it with all of you guys, because it'll help me even know, like, how should I increase my dose? And then I'll retest and see what it took dosing wise to really get a good result on the red blood cell. So I'm using myself as a guinea pig.
I mean, I noticed, like, I started taking probably when I was like 16 weeks pregnant, because I just kind of learned about it. I started with just the half teaspoon, whatever the maintenance dose is on the bottle, but I've taken it continually. My alk phos went from 40 something to 70 something, and it was during pregnancy. So there really wasn't a lot I changed, but it's maintained that. Alk phos can elevate in pregnancy, but it's continued to stay at that level. So I know that it had a huge impact on the way that my mitochondria is actually functioning, the cells and the health of it. That's a cool marker to notice and see, hey, this is when I started it. What's your retest look like?
Yep. So once I run that, I'll share it with y'all, because I got to learn how to read it. Apparently they're really complicated. So I might actually have Justine come on a call and break mine down for everybody, so we
That'd
can
be
learn.
cool.
Angeline, yeah, so this is LOL. So Angeline said, I don't usually do this, but just started Inspire Cell a week ago and feeling worse. So this is why I have not posted about it online. And this is why we did not put B12 and folate in our B complex, because of something called hypermethylation. For a lot of people, that supplement is going to drive their neurotransmitters too high. In kids, you're going to see nightmares and screaming. In adults, you're going to see anxiety and hyperventilation. The testimonies you're seeing are people who are so completely depleted in every area, where they need that uptick. But in the same token, if they were to take it every day ongoing, it's going to lead to what you felt. Does that make sense?
Okay, so I think I'm an undermethylator, so I just assumed I would like go up to normal or feel good, and it made me feel terrible.
Yes. Well, even with undermethylation, you have to be so careful, where those people even need like just the basic Bs and something like SAMe even sometimes. So when we did that methylation call with you guys, we talked about like, and it's been a while since we've done that, but the nutrients needed for both. And usually, just even with undermethylators, they bring that in. It's gonna trigger a lot of what you probably went through.
Yeah.
And did you see all this happen with artichoke? It helped some people, but then people said, wait a second, my acne got way worse and I gained 10 pounds and now it won't come off. Well, yeah, you just depleted your body of key things that clogged other drainage pathways, other forms of estrogen detox. It's like we've said, you're, getting it out of the house. You put all the garbage trucks outside. It's out of your house now, but what has it done? It now reeks up the whole neighborhood. Does that make sense?
So what do you recommend? Just don't take it, or just cut it in half, or just, what do you think?
I wouldn't take it.
Okay.
It's a key sign if someone takes that and feels worse, that's an absolute, you don't need it.
Okay. Thank you. I still feel bad. Like I haven't leveled back out. And I just assumed like it's a detox. If I keep taking it, I'll start feeling better, and I'm not feeling better.
No, you shouldn't feel a detox from micronutrients when they're the right ones.
Okay. That's what I want to.
think the key is like, it's the people who are going to do well on it are the people who really, really need it. Like said, who are very depleted. Like I did start it with Asher, and I've given it to him for a few days and he hasn't had any terrible reactions of any sort, but I know that he needs those nutrients based on his oat test. So I also started doing B12 injections with him at home. That's part of the therapies that I've kind of like gone just balls to the walls with all this stuff. And he's doing really well on B12 injections, which tells me that his body, I mean, I can see on a lab, like he is very, very low in B12. But again, to other people, it's the form of the B12 too, or any type of, methylated. There's a million different types of B12. Some people don't do well with the methylcobalamin. Some people need cyanocobalamin. It just depends. And so that's the hardship of like seeing all these results and kind of like claims of this InspireCell product as people are doing so great and take it and see it. It's like, I was resistant for a really long time to even try it, but I know more details than probably a lot of the people taking it do. So it's going to backfire eventually for some people. I don't know. We'll see.
Symptoms are truly the best way to know if you're an under or over methylator. A lot of tests aren't very accurate, and also looking at the clues on blood work we've taught y'all: homocysteine, AST, ALT, your H markers and your M markers, your GGT, your cholesterol and LDL, because if you're an over methylator, that doesn't mean you're an over methylator forever. It's that the way that your body's currently performing, if you were to take something, it would push you into over methylation and vice versa. So like, for example, someone can go carnivore, and if they have a gene, this is where genetics come in, like an underperforming MTR gene, it can actually lead to an increase in homocysteine, which is a problem. If they stop carnivore, then they can start recycling things like SAMe better so that it's not getting trapped and elevating homocysteine. So symptoms are going to be a big one. But for the most part, like, Allie, did you ever get a blood work panel on Asher?
Yeah.
Low AST is usually under, but it's a need for B6, not B12 folate. B6 is a really big one. Big one. Yeah. But if you did and his homocysteine was elevated and you see MMA off and you've run oats with like lots of, hey, he needs B12, then that's a different scenario.
Yeah, so another thing I was going to mention, it kind of falls into this topic, but kind of goes back to why we also didn't include folate. There can be a lot of issues with people in folate as well. So there's a very specific test. It's mostly done for kids with autism, but it's called a FRAT test, FRAT. And it's basically it's a folate receptor antibody test. And some kids, they basically will have antibodies against folate. So you're giving them folate and their bodies are producing antibodies, their brain's never getting it. And so they need a very, very specific type of folate called folinic acid. And it's done mostly the high levels that these kids need it because they've never been able to really truly absorb folate, is like through even just like a pharmaceutical. It's called leucovorin, is a medication, but it's really, really high folinic acid. And so it's interesting because some people, yes, they need folate, but they can't get it because of their genetic makeup. So it's just another reason why there's going to be things that don't work for certain people.
Yeah. And when in doubt, run a micronutrient panel. It'll tell you what you need.
The most annoying part about the FRAT test is it is a blood test. And we did that and it came back as basically inconclusive. He had a result that was different from what the lab is normally used to seeing. So they were like, well, we don't know if we need it. We'll have to try and give it to him and see. And I'm like, wow, that's great. But that is an abnormal situation, apparently.
Okay, someone asked earlier how to further tell with symptoms. So if someone is over methylating, usually multiple chemical sensitivities are going to be present. If they were to take an SSRI, they'd have a poor reaction to it. I think that now this is where I get confused. Do over methylators have issues with folic acid, Allie?
Over methylators with folic acid. Yeah, they can.
Right. So I think that over
It's not converting.
I think that over methylators need folinic acid.
Folinic.
Yes.
Well, I think that folinic acid could be an undermethylation issue or an overmethylation issue. Because it's basically what the body is going to absorb and utilize.
Yep. Yeah.
But yeah, folinic acid, it's interesting.
But the two most important nutrients, so Angeline, going back to like, okay, you reacted to that, so there's probably overmethylation going on, is B3 and B5. And then if someone's undermethylating, B6 is essential. B6 is helpful for both, but with undermethylation, SAMe and B6 are so big, so is PC, choline too. So yeah, very, very complex sometimes.
Sure is. Sure is.
I was like going back and forth on messages. So if you got back to me, Allie or I don't know, but I'm a little confused about the micronutrient test. I've never done one. Is it like a blood test or a urine test? And like, what exactly does it look at? And do you think I should do that basically? Because I think that sounds interesting.
I love it. It tests the cellular levels of amino acids, vitamins, minerals, antioxidant status, and it's accurate because it's the cellular response versus a serum test.
Is
But
it
also,
like, do you do like a urine test that you mail in
No,
through blood?
It's through blood, but then they measure the cell component of it, which is why it's a larger turnaround time.
Is it super expensive?
It's one of the more expensive tests, yeah.
either 300 or 400, I can't remember.
Or it's probably like, I think it's like $389.
Do you think that like, just being that I've done a few creating balanced health tests and I'm definitely going to do a new blood work, but do you think that would be like more insightful than the CBH test at this point?
I love the micronutrient testing, but again, it comes back to what you're really wanting to see, you know? I mean, I think it's a great test, you know, but if you were like, hey, hormones are my priority, then I'd say Dutch test is the best test. If you're like, hey, I want to know if metals and mineral ratios, okay, then HTMA is the best test, you know? So it just depends.
I mean, start with blood work too. You don't have to do things at the same time. If it's been a while since blood work, start there, see what we see, because we might look at all these indicators and then that's going to dictate what the next test is, if needed.
I definitely want to see if we made any progress with like mold and with like the anemia, ferritin stuff.
And that's just basic blood work, which is where we have everyone start.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. And then like, you know, if someone is like, hey, I was in mold and I moved out of mold and I have my current oat test or my current mycotoxin test, and then like 5 months, they want to see if they've improved, then they would get a urinary mycotoxin panel. So that's why like for everyone, we're not like, hey, everyone needs this test at the completion, because it's just so different. Other people want to see, hey, am I dealing with Lyme or co-infections? And they'll do a vibrant wellness test, you know? So just, there's a lot of tests, but they all do different stuff.
But don't forget about what? Foundation. Testing is great, but it can also be expensive. And when in doubt, go back to foundation.
Yep. So true. Like today, all the hormone and brain stuff, and it's stress, blood sugar, and nutrients, optimal digestion, minerals, good water, good air, good sleep, time off phone. Basics.
Yep.
Yeah, castor oil packs, great. Drainage essentials, great. All those are good. I got my lemon water here.
I don't think I've ever seen you drink lemon water.
It's not, I just ate a seed. It's my new thing.
See how well I know Emily? Just like this is what's happening. This is weird.
Yeah, I don't really ever drink water, so lemon helps. You know, basics.
Oh.
All right, well, we'll condense those slides for y'all. Upload the replay. Go from there.
Yeah. If there's any other questions, put them in the portal. I think we might be a little behind on doing some of the questions or answers. So we'll get back to you if we owe you any answers on stuff. All right.
All right. Bye, y'all.
All right, you guys have a great week.
See you later.
I don't know why I'm being weird. Okay. Love you. Bye.